What do I got? I'll give it my best. The question was asked with regards to what can internal audit do with regards to export controls compliance or export controls. I think the first task here is maybe just to define what is export controls and export controls compliance. Obviously, regulations that govern the export or re-export and transfer of goods, which includes, by the way, technology and services across borders. That certainly falls into the purview here. And the whole purpose, it's really designed to protect national security, enforce foreign policy, and prevent sensitive materials from reaching unauthorized parties. And so that's a lot of people just don't understand that. And then sort of the major US regulations of all of this, and there are others for sure, but there's the Export Administration Regulations, which are the EAR. They're overseen by the Bureau of Industry and Security, the BIS, and they cover dual use goods. And then there's the ITAR, which I think we heard a lot about, which is the International Trafficking in Arms Regulation. That's managed by the State Department, and they regulate defense-related exports. And then there's OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, which obviously administers sanctions, programs restricting trade with specific countries and entities. The risk associated with noncompliance is also important to really understand here before we get into what internal audit needs to do. Obviously, there's legal and financial risks associated with this, and then violations can lead to heavy fines, criminal charges, and debarment from government contracts, which really for some could be a death sentence. There are several companies that have faced multi-billion-dollar penalties for violations. I'm not going to mention them. I think we all know who they are. Obviously, reputational damage for noncompliance, negative press, loss of customer trust, things like that, and shareholder concerns certainly related to export controls. Obviously, a publicized violation really can cause long-term broad damage to an organization. And yeah, especially in sensitive industries, for example, aerospace is one that I could think of, defense and certainly technology, which I kind of mentioned before. And then there's obviously operational disruptions, supply chain disruptions, if licenses are actually revoked or restrictions are imposed. Everyone's so concerned about supply chain today, but a lot of people don't understand really what the ramifications are from an export controls perspective, which is really interesting. Then there's obviously, from an operation perspective, again, loss of market access in key regions and companies that are actually become blacklisted, problematic. National security risks certainly comes into play. Sometimes I was involved a long time ago with the accidental transfer of dual-use technology, which means that civilian tech is paired with military applications without a company actually really thinking through or knowing about that to unauthorized parties. That became a real issue. And then there's cyber threats if controlled data is exposed to foreign adversaries. So there's a bunch of things here that certainly are risks and risks of noncompliance. So that if we get into the role of internal audit now and what they can do, obviously ensuring compliance frameworks are in place is certainly one thing. That seems to be ever changing though, but internal audit should really evaluate whether the organization has a couple of things in place. Robust policies and procedures for one, that align with the regulations that I mentioned, the EAR, ITAR, and OFAC requirements. There should be clear responsibilities assigned for export compliance. Somebody needs to really take ownership of all of this. Obviously, we all talk about this, and this becomes ultra critical here when it comes to export controls. Training programs for employees handling control items or controlled data, certainly something. I've been involved again in developing training initiatives, and I've sat in on seminars and things like that. And it seems like export controls is sort of one of those things that's talked about sometimes, either in its totality or it's kind of brushed off. Certainly that certainly becomes a play here for internal audit. Risk assessments and monitoring. Auditors should conduct risk assessments to identify a couple of really key things here, in my opinion. Certainly high risk transactions, products, or specific business units that could be problematic. They should identify gaps in compliance programs that could lead to violations. They should regularly monitor red flags. And, red flags obviously doesn't necessarily mean that there's something wrong, but should force people to stop and reassess. And those red flags, just a couple of just real quick. I know we're up against a couple of things here, but shipments to embargoed countries, for example. A lot of organizations don't necessarily track those or identify those. Or the other thing, which I think is pretty interesting, unusual customer requests related to product specifications or destinations. Much like with a vendor or somebody in payroll changing where they want their payroll sent or where they want to be paid, when a customer makes a request to change certain things, for product specifications is one, or the destinations or where the products is supposed to be going, that should really be looked at very closely. So any type of those changes, really from an internal audit perspective, is a good thing to really start looking at. And then going into sort of the next deep dive of this, which is the testing phase on auditing these controls, internal audit. These are some of the things that, again, from my experience, should do. Obviously, transaction testing, which I'm a big fan of, to ensure compliance with licensing and classification rules. That's one. Data analytics, which we keep talking about, to flag anomalies in export transactions. You really need to understand all of this, though, in order to set that up. Everybody thinks data analytics is as simple as running data, but if you don't understand what the desired outcomes are supposed to be, your data analytics is just nothing. It's garbage. Obviously, third-party due diligence, which we all have talked about ad nauseum, but audits to assess compliance risk in supplier and distribution and distributor relationships. That's another thing that certainly from a testing perspective, incident response and investigations, internal auditors should evaluate if the company has strong reporting mechanisms for potential violations. I remember long ago that company had a hotline in place, but they said, if it's not really related to fraud or ethics, then we don't really use the hotline. We have another channel. Like, that's not good. Obviously, a proper reporting mechanism for potential violations is something that really we should be paying attention to. And then the other thing, obviously, triaging allegations and investigations that have to be handled appropriately, and corrective actions obviously need to be implemented on a timely basis. The other key thing that I really wanted to point out here is that, and we talk about this a lot too, but it's really important that internal audit collaborate with legal and compliance. They can't be isolated or siloed here. They should not work in isolation by any stretch of the imagination. Strong partnerships with legal and compliance, and obviously the supply chain teams, which I mentioned, really do ensure an integrated approach to managing these export risks. And they open up lines of communication. The more transparent, the more information, obviously, the better internal audit can do with regards to designing their testing and making sure that they really understand exactly what those particular risks are within an organization. Really, just to kind of just bring this back in, export controls compliance is it's not just a legal requirement. It's a critical component of risk management and corporate responsibility, which is why we're talking about it today. And internal audit does play a key role in ensuring that, obviously, a proactive compliance approach, which would be mitigating risks and strengthening corporate governance, are really tantamount to really trying to get in front of all this. Companies that take export controls seriously not only avoid or can potentially thwart legal trouble, but they actually build trust with regulators, customers, and their global partners. And we all want to do business with people that we trust and people that are obeying the laws and following the guidelines and the regulations. Hopefully today I provided you with a small glimpse or a structure that was at least informative for you to ask more questions or to really double check exactly what your internal audit group or your internal audit department is doing, and allow you to tweak and modify your report accordingly, because this is a risk. Companies have been fined, and it's something that, again, it's when you ask people about cryptocurrency and to define it, if you ask people about export controls, oftentimes, more often than not, I get really silly answers. Hopefully this is informative and the audience will have some takeaways.
Karen Moore, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I do. I was really interested, Jonathan, to your comment about changes to the destination of the product or to the product specification, which may either intentionally or inadvertently be designed to avoid export controls or restrictions. Is that a workflow issue? Is that just making sure that in the process of getting something to where it needs to be, that there are some checks and balances? Or is there a broader implication there? Because it does seem to me something that's really ripe for a bit of corruption to get somebody to change some specs or to change an end destination or the flow through country nefariously where a workflow maybe wouldn't catch it. And what are your thoughts there?
I think it goes back to logic and sense. I hate to go back to the old Star Trek stuff, but if it's not logical, then obviously somebody should follow up with it. If somebody's asking for a product specification, again, the organization that's actually doing the work or manufacturing the product or distributing the technology, they should understand exactly what those ramifications are for those specific changes and if it could be used nefariously. And then with regards to changing destination, obviously you have organizations or countries that are less riskier than others. If somebody's doing business in London, they want stuff that to be shipped to Venezuela for some reason or some other country. I'm not discriminating against countries here, but you have to understand, is there some logical reason for that if they don't have any type of presence there? And again, it really goes back to the old trust but verify, but also it goes back to common sense, not just trying to placate a customer to make changes and keep the business, but do these things make sense? Or do these things, meaning changing the product spec or changing the destination of the shipment of the product, do they add additional red flags to this relationship that requires further review and discussion? And I think that's really what this is all about. It's an awareness exercise. It's a communication exercise. And that's where I think that people that are, in procurement or people that are on the manufacturing side or people who are in supply chain or internal audit, legal and compliance really can't work anymore in isolation. When these things come up, there should be a plan in place, really identify to bring those to the next level and have those things reviewed. I call it the 4 Eyes principle and other parts of when we're doing compliance or internal audit. I think the same applies here.